This lecture will cover the respiratory system with a focus on anatomy and breathing. Be able to define lungs, alveoli, pharynx, larynx, epiglottis, trachea, and bronchi. Diagram the components of both upper and lower respiratory tracts. Be able to label all components and list the order that air will pass them. List and label all muscles involved in breathing. There are two. Diagram gas exchange in alveoli and capillaries. Define inspiratory volume, tidal volume, expiratory volume, residual volume, as well as vital capacity, and explain how oxygen homeostasis is controlled. There are different parts of the respiratory system we're going to look at. This will not be incredibly in-depth, but more of an overview. We're going to divide it into the upper respiratory system and the lower respiratory system, with the trachea being the spot in between them. And you can see how there is upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract, and this is relevant to your upper respiratory infections and lower respiratory infections. So first off, let's look at the upper respiratory tract. This will be the nose and mouth first, mainly the nose, because we're going to look at the mouth with digestion too. And you can see that there are different parts of the nose. And you can see how the nose goes to the auditory tube and that there is an opening in the back to what is called the pharynx. The pharynx goes behind the mouth as well. And you can see there the glottis and epiglottis right behind the mouth, the epiglottis being this cartilaginous shield basically for the trachea. So the epiglottis will go down when the tongue swallows, and it will cover the trachea and larynx so that food does not go to the trachea and larynx, but rather food goes to the esophagus. But that's a different system to cover. And the trachea and esophagus cross here, so that's kind of where all that choking comes from. Below the epiglottis is the larynx, and that's what we also known as the voice box. This is where vocal cords are present. They vibrate as air is moved across them. Testosterone causes the larynx to get larger at puberty, causing the deeper voice, which is realistically just a measure of how large the larynx is and how much testosterone the individual has been exposed to. The trachea is a tube for air, and the trachea can narrow, and with the smooth muscle contracting and air being expelled quickly, causes a rapid movement of air in a smaller amount of space, and that's going to cause a cough. So that's one type of reflex, and as you might notice, if it squeezes, if there's something stuck in the trachea and the trachea squeezes, that's not always going to dislodge it, so that can be even more of a problem if it squeezes around the object, hence choking is such a problem. And the trachea will lead to the lower respiratory tract. We can see that there. And these are basically inflatable bags that we call lungs. We also can see here the diaphragm and intercostal muscles, which we'll cover in a little bit. This part of the body is highly vascularized. There's a lot of blood here. If you remember the heart lecture, you saw the pulmonary circuit is going to be servicing this. So there's a lot of blood flowing through here, picking up oxygen and delivering it back to the heart. In this system, there are cilia to move mucus and remove dirt. You occasionally breathe in dirt, smoke, and other debris, and mucus is produced at a constant, slow level. Cilia in the lungs are going to move the mucus up towards the epiglottis, and then it can be swallowed back in the esophagus. Gulp. And that lets it be digested. So in a healthy airway, there are plentiful cilia and a certain low level of mucus. In an unhealthy airway, you're going to see the damaged cilia and or too much mucus being produced. Let's take a look at these lungs. So the pleural membranes here are protecting the lungs from the ribs, of course. So lungs, as they're inflating and deflating, don't rub against the ribs. We'll talk about the intercostal muscles in a moment. The lobes of the lungs, you can see there are 3 lobes of the right lung and 2 lobes of the left lung, each of which is filled with bronchioles, which are these branching parts of the trachea. So they branch down and branch smaller and smaller, kind of like large roads going into small roads, going into basically little cul-de-sacs. And at the end of these cul-de-sacs are these alveoli. And the alveoli are these air sacs, and air will fill in the alveolus. And it has a very thin membrane between the alveolar air and the capillaries. So you can see again, you have the pulmonary venule and the pulmonary arteriole. Deoxygenated blood will come through the pulmonary arteriole, go past the alveoli, pick up oxygen, go back in the pulmonary venule, and go back towards the heart. This is also where carbon dioxide is transferred. CO2 will go from the blood into the air of the alveolus and be breathed out. So the alveoli are where oxygen and CO2 are exchanged in the lungs. The diaphragm and intercostal muscles are going to aid in breathing. The intercostal muscles are between the ribs, and they pull to allow the ribs to expand. And the diaphragm, as you can see, the diaphragm contracting pulls the lungs down, which causes the lung volume to increase. And since the volume increases, the pressure decreases in that air, which allows the lungs to essentially suck air out of the atmosphere. So it's called negative pressure breathing. Then the diaphragm is going to relax. And as the diaphragm relaxes, the lung volume decreases and the air pressure rises. Now, you may have heard of people saying sing from your diaphragm. What they actually mean is squeezing. You're not squeezing your diaphragm because the diaphragm relaxes when you're breathing out. You're actually squeezing the muscles in your stomach and pushing your visceral mass, essentially your intestines, up as the diaphragm relaxes to push the air out. So the intercostals and diaphragm are the muscles involved in breathing. During breathing, we're going to see a certain amount of air brought in and a certain amount brought out. And this is variable between individuals based not only on the size of their lungs, but on their lung health. Vital capacity is the total amount of air that you can have in your lungs. So this is going to be made up of basically how much you can breathe in when you fully breathe in, and then how far you can breathe out when you fully breathe out. Your inspiratory reserve is how much more you could breathe in than you normally breathe. Your expiratory reserve is how much more you could breathe out than you normally breathe. How much do you normally breathe? Well, that's the tidal volume. And you can see here an individual with emphysema has a lower inspiratory reserve and a lower expiratory reserve and cannot move that air out as quickly. So it's a lung disorder, showing that there is a reduction in the total vital capacity, even though their tidal volume is actually the same because their normal breathing is not different. The residual volume is just air that is left in your lungs and stays in your lungs because there's always some air in your lungs so they don't collapse. The body needs oxygen to make H2O in the process known as oxidative phosphorylation, which you may remember from the metabolism lecture. Oxygen is that final electron acceptor of the electron transport chain. Now, we get oxygen from the air, which is 21% oxygen. It diffuses from the air to the hemoglobin, remember the blood lecture, in the lungs. And not that the lungs are full of hemoglobin, we're talking the alveoli are bordering capillaries. Those capillaries have blood cells, and those blood cells have hemoglobin. Oxygen diffuses from hemoglobin to active tissues in the systemic circuit. And this is determined by the partial pressure of oxygen in the air and in these tissues. So you can see here with inhaled air, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 160. Look all the way to the bottom and you see the interstitial fluid surrounding the cells. The partial pressure of oxygen is less than 40. In a cell that is actively respiring, like your muscle cells when you run, you're going to draw that partial pressure of oxygen even lower as the body uses up oxygen. What this means is that air will be inhaled, it'll go into the alveoli, and then it will move down its concentration gradient from the alveolus to the capillaries. Now that oxygen moves into the capillaries, is pumped throughout the body, and then as it's pumped throughout the body, it goes to those cells, and oxygen, as you can see, goes from the capillaries to the interstitial fluid surrounding the cells, and that is how oxygen diffuses. It's going down its concentration gradient and is being sped along by the movement of blood, which is actively carrying the oxygen. Carbon dioxide is following the opposite pattern, where the highest concentration of carbon dioxide is in your cells and around your cells, especially those that are actively respiring as they give off CO2 as part of the citric acid cycle. And this will be transported in your blood, and then will go to the lung capillaries, and the lung capillaries will put out CO2 from the capillaries to the alveolus, and that alveolar air will be exhaled at the next exhalation, putting that CO2 back in the environment. Here's another little diagram of that, how this is transported. The oxygen is transported 2% in the plasma, and 98% is transported on hemoglobin. So really just say hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide is a little more complicated. We're not getting into the weeds with this one in this lecture. About 10% in plasma, about 20% combined with hemoglobin, and about 70% goes into the blood and then is turned into bicarbonate, HCO3, which dissolves into plasma as an ion. And that gets a little more complicated, but basically this is one way that carbon dioxide is transported, and that HCO3 minus, that actually does have a proton that it gives up, so that does actually make the blood a little more acidic when you have a lot of CO2 in there. So respiration is controlled overall in this homeostatic process by the brain. So we have a set point, which is a certain level of oxygen in the body. Well, actually in the brain, because it's the cerebral spinal fluid, although it's not oxygen directly. Oh no, that'd be too simple. What it actually is how acidic your blood is. So remember how I said that when CO2 dissolves in the blood, it makes that a little bit more acidity. So it becomes H2CO3, which dissociates into H plus and HCO3 minus. Those H pluses can be detected by sensors. So we have set point, the acidity of the blood. Stimulus, the acidity of the blood changes when CO2 goes up. Sensor, receptor cells near the respiratory center detect how much H plus is present in the cerebral spinal fluid, which is like blood. And then the medulla oblongata is your control center, which is going to tell your lungs to breathe faster, which is a response. So there's also receptors in the intercostal muscles, which tell how inflated the lungs are, which is a good thing to kind of measure how much are you actually breathing. So the body uses this information to control respiration and maintain oxygen homeostasis, and it all goes through the lungs.